The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets of Denver as Marcus Thompson adjusted his binoculars from the rooftop of the old Paramount Theater. 3 years had passed since the outbreak transformed 90% of America's population into flesh-hungry monsters, and the remaining survivors had learned that dawn was both blessing and curse. It revealed the horrors of the previous night while offering a brief respite from the hunting packs that prowled in darkness. Marcus counted 17 zombies shuffling through the intersection below, their decaying forms moving with that distinctive jerky gait that had become humanity's nightmare. His radio crackled to life, and the voice of Rebecca Martinez, their group's communications specialist, whispered urgently through the static. "Marcus, we've got movement from the south. Big movement. Looks like a horde, maybe 300 strong, heading straight for the settlement." Marcus felt his stomach drop as he swung his binoculars toward the horizon, where a dark mass of bodies moved like a living carpet across the decimated landscape. The Paramount Theater had become home to 47 survivors over the past 8 months, transformed from a place of entertainment into humanity's last stand in the Colorado region. Dr. James Mitchell, a former CDC researcher who had been studying the virus when civilization collapsed, emerged from the theater's basement laboratory where he had been working tirelessly on understanding the pathogen's evolution. His weathered face showed the strain of sleepless nights spent analyzing blood samples and documenting the horrifying changes he had observed in the infected. "Marcus, we need to talk," Mitchell called out as he climbed the emergency stairs to the roof. "I've discovered something about the virus that changes everything we thought we knew." The older man's hands trembled slightly as he handed Marcus a manila folder filled with test results and photographs that made the hardened survivor's blood run cold. Lieutenant Colonel David Hayes, formerly of the 82nd Airborne Division, had been organizing the settlement's defenses when the radio chatter reached him in the theater's main auditorium. His military training had kept them alive this long, turning the ornate venue into a fortress complete with reinforced barricades, weapons caches, and multiple escape routes. Hayes gathered his core team, including Maria Santos, a former police officer who had become their best scout, and Tyler Brooks, a young mechanic whose ingenuity with improvised weapons had saved them countless times. "People, we've got a situation," Hayes announced to the assembled survivors, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had led soldiers through hell and brought them home. "Intelligence suggests we're facing the largest horde we've encountered, and Dr. Mitchell has information that's going to change our entire strategy." As the survivors huddled in the dim lighting of the theater, illuminated only by battery-powered lanterns and the pale morning light filtering through boarded windows, Mitchell spread his research across an improvised table made from theater seats. The photographs showed zombies that appeared different from the shambling masses they had grown accustomed to fighting. These creatures moved with purpose, showed signs of basic problem-solving, and most terrifyingly, seemed to be hunting in coordinated groups. "The virus is evolving," Mitchell explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "What we're seeing isn't just mindless hunger anymore. These things are developing rudimentary intelligence, and they're learning from each encounter with survivors." Rebecca's radio suddenly erupted with frantic chatter from their outer perimeter scouts, and the words that came through sent a chill through every person in the room. "They're not just approaching randomly, they're surrounding us." Marcus looked around at the faces of the people who had become his extended family in this hellish new world. Elena Rodriguez, the former teacher who had taken charge of the settlement's children, her protective instincts making her fiercer than any soldier. Robert Kim, the former grocery store manager whose organizational skills had kept them fed when supplies ran low, and Amanda Foster, the nurse whose medical knowledge had been their lifeline through countless injuries and illnesses. These weren't just survivors anymore, they were the remnants of American civilization, carrying within them the hopes and memories of a world that had been devoured by its own dead. Hayes began issuing orders with military precision, knowing that the coming hours would determine whether humanity's flame would continue to burn in Colorado or be extinguished forever. The theater that had once echoed with applause and laughter now filled with the sound of weapons being checked, ammunition being distributed, and quiet prayers being whispered by people who knew they were about to face their greatest test yet in this post-apocalyptic wasteland that had once been the United States of America. The silence that followed Dr. Mitchell's revelation hung in the theater like a suffocating shroud, broken only by the distant groans of the undead and the nervous shuffling of boots against the worn carpet. Marcus felt his world shift as he stared at the photographs spread before them, images that defied everything they thought they knew about their enemy. The zombies in these pictures weren't the mindless, shambling corpses they had been fighting for 3 years. These creatures stood upright with an unsettling awareness in their clouded eyes, their movements coordinated and purposeful in ways that sent ice through his veins. "How long have you known about this?" Lieutenant Colonel Hayes demanded, his military bearing barely containing the fury and fear that threatened to overwhelm his tactical mind. Mitchell's weathered hands trembled as he pointed to a series of dated observations, his voice cracking under the weight of his discovery. "I've been tracking behavioral changes for 6 weeks, but I only confirmed the mutation yesterday when I analyzed tissue samples from that zombie Maria brought back from her last patrol." Rebecca's radio equipment suddenly erupted with static-filled voices from their perimeter scouts, and the words that emerged through the interference made every survivor's blood turn to ice water. "Base, this is Outpost 3, we've got eyes on the horde and they're not moving like any we've seen before. They're split into smaller groups, surrounding us in a coordinated pattern. It's like they're executing a military flanking maneuver." Marcus grabbed the radio from Rebecca's shaking hands and barked into the device. "Outpost 3, fall back to secondary positions immediately. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary." The response that came back was filled with panic and confusion as Scout Williams reported, "Sir, we can't fall back, they've already cut off our retreat routes. It's like they knew exactly where we would try to go." Elena Rodriguez gathered the settlement's 12 children into the theater's basement, her maternal instincts kicking into overdrive as she tried to maintain calm while her mind raced with terrifying possibilities. The youngest survivor, 8-year-old Timothy Walsh, tugged at her sleeve with tears streaming down his dirt-stained face. "Miss Elena, are the monsters getting smarter?" he whispered, his innocent question cutting straight to the heart of their nightmare. Elena forced a reassuring smile while her hand unconsciously moved to the pistol holstered at her hip, knowing that if these new zombies were truly intelligent, traditional hiding spots and escape routes would become death traps. Amanda Foster worked frantically in their makeshift medical station, preparing trauma kits and checking their dwindling supply of antibiotics while her nurses training Ward with her growing panic about what intelligent zombies might mean for infection control and treatment protocols. Tyler Brooks and Maria Santos prepared for what might be their most dangerous reconnaissance mission yet, checking their equipment with the methodical precision that had kept them alive through countless encounters with the undead. Tyler's modified crossbow, fitted with retrieval cables and noise suppressors, felt inadequate against an enemy that could potentially outthink them. Maria studied the settlement's defensive positions through her sniper scope, noting every weakness and blind spot that these evolved creatures might exploit. "If they're really learning from our tactics," she muttered to Tyler as they prepared to move out, "then everything we've done to survive up to this point might actually be helping them plan our destruction." The weight of that realization settled over both scouts like a burial shroud as they slipped through the theater's emergency exit into the gray morning light. Dr. Mitchell continued his briefing to the remaining survivors, his scientific objectivity warring with his human terror as he explained the implications of viral evolution in a post-apocalyptic ecosystem. The alpha variants appear to retain fragments of human memory and problem-solving ability while maintaining the virus's enhanced physical capabilities and insatiable hunger, he explained, his voice growing hoarse with exhaustion and fear. "They're not just hunting for food anymore, they're hunting strategically, using tactics that suggest they remember military or law enforcement training from their previous lives." Robert Kim, whose organizational skills had kept them supplied and fed, began calculating how long their resources would last against a siege conducted by intelligent adversaries who could adapt and learn from each failed assault. Hayes assembled his core defense team in the theater's orchestra pit, transforming the elegant space into a war room where survival strategy would be planned with desperate creativity. The ornate walls that had once echoed with music now reverberated with the sound of weapons being cleaned and tactical discussions that would determine whether humanity's last beacon in Colorado would shine through another dawn. As Marcus and Maria prepared to venture into a world where the rules of survival had fundamentally changed, every person in the Paramount Theater understood that they were no longer fighting for their lives against mindless monsters. They were engaged in a battle of wits against an enemy that grew more dangerous with every passing hour. The first shadows of evening stretched across Denver's skeletal remains when the attack began, not with the chaotic frenzy they had grown accustomed to, but with a calculated precision that made Marcus's skin crawl as he watched through his binoculars from the theater's highest window. The alpha zombies moved through the streets below like a dark tide of intelligence, their decomposing forms somehow retaining enough coordination to execute what could only be described as a military assault. Hayes had positioned his defenders according to every tactical manual he had memorized during his years of service, but within minutes of the first contact, he realized with growing horror that the enemy was adapting to their defensive positions faster than any human army he had ever faced. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the theater as the first wave of attackers found weaknesses in their barricades that shouldn't have been discoverable so quickly, exploiting blind spots and structural vulnerabilities with an efficiency that defied everything they understood about the undead. Rebecca's communication station became the nerve center of their desperate resistance as radio chatter flooded in from settlements across the Colorado region, each transmission more terrifying than the last. "This is Phoenix Base in Colorado Springs," came a crackling voice through the static, punctuated by gunfire and human screams. "We're under coordinated attack by intelligent hostiles. They've cut our power and water lines first, then systematically eliminated our escape routes. Request immediate assistance." The transmission cut to static, followed by similar distress calls from Fort Collins, Boulder, and even isolated homesteads that had remained hidden for years. Marcus felt the weight of realization crushing down on him as he understood that this wasn't just an attack on their settlement, it was a coordinated assault on every remaining pocket of human resistance in the region, planned and executed with a strategic brilliance that suggested the alpha zombies had been observing and learning from human survival patterns for months. Dr. Mitchell worked frantically in his basement laboratory, trying to analyze tissue samples under the flickering light of battery-powered equipment while the sounds of battle raged above him. His scientific instruments, salvaged from abandoned hospitals and research facilities, revealed cellular structures that challenged everything he thought he knew about viral pathology. The alpha variants showed brain activity patterns that resembled human cognitive function, but accelerated and focused entirely on predatory behavior and tactical analysis. "They're not just remembering their human lives," he muttered to himself as he documented his findings, his hands shaking as much from exhaustion as from the explosive impacts that shook dust from the theater's ceiling. "They're improving on those memories, becoming more effective killers by combining human intelligence with viral enhancements." Elena appeared at the laboratory door, her face pale with terror as she reported that the children had begun asking questions about the different sounds of combat echoing through their refuge. Maria Santos found herself trapped on the theater's third-floor balcony as a group of alpha zombies demonstrated problem-solving abilities that turned her sniper's advantage into a liability. These creatures had learned to use the abandoned cars and debris in the street as cover, moving with tactical awareness that made every shot a calculated risk rather than the guaranteed kills she had grown used to. One of the alphas, a former police officer based on the tattered uniform still clinging to its decomposing frame, actually seemed to be directing the others and flanking maneuvers designed to force her out of her elevated position. Tyler's voice crackled through her radio headset, breathless with panic and exertion as he reported from the theater's main floor. "Maria, they're using tools. I just watched one of them pick up a crowbar and show 3 others how to use it to pry open our reinforced doors. They're teaching each other." Amanda Foster's medical station became an impromptu triage center as the first casualties of the new type of warfare began arriving with wounds that told a terrifying story. Unlike the random bite marks and tears they had treated from previous zombie encounters, these injuries showed evidence of targeted attacks designed to disable rather than simply kill. "They're going for tendons and major muscle groups," she reported to Hayes over the radio while bandaging a scout who had barely escaped with his life. "It's like they understand human anatomy well enough to cripple us systematically." Robert Kim coordinated the distribution of their carefully rationed ammunition from his supply station in the theater's former coat check room, but even his meticulous inventory management couldn't hide the fact that they were burning through resources at an unsustainable rate against enemies who seemed to learn from every defensive strategy they employed. As midnight approached and the attacks intensified, the survivors huddled in the Paramount Theater realized that their fortress had become their tomb, surrounded by an enemy that grew more dangerous with each passing hour of combat experience. The ornate venue that had once hosted performances for Denver's elite now echoed with the sounds of a siege that would determine whether human intelligence could triumph over viral evolution, or whether the last light of civilization in Colorado would be extinguished by creatures that had learned to think like humans while retaining the relentless hunger of the undead. The pounding on the theater's reinforced rear entrance came at 3 a.m, a desperate rhythm that cut through the sounds of the ongoing siege like a lifeline thrown to drowning souls. Marcus pressed his ear against the heavy steel door, listening to voices that spoke in human cadences rather than the guttural moans they had grown to fear, but trust had become a luxury more precious than ammunition in their post-apocalyptic world. "Please, we know you're in there," came a woman's voice raw with exhaustion and terror. "We're survivors from the Aurora settlement. The intelligent ones overran us 6 hours ago, and we've been running ever since." Hayes approached the door with his rifle raised, his military training warring with his human compassion as he weighed the risks of opening their sanctuary to strangers who might be infected, desperate, or worse, collaborators with the evolved enemy that had proven capable of using human psychology against them. Through the door's reinforced window, Maria could see 8 figures huddled in the alley, their clothing torn and blood-stained, their faces bearing the hollow-eyed look of people who had witnessed the collapse of everything they had built to survive. Among them stood a man whose bearing suggested military training, his gray hair and weathered features familiar in a way that made her stomach clench with recognition. "Hayes," she whispered urgently, "that's Jackson Webb. He was at the CDC facility in Atlanta when the outbreak started. I saw his photo in some of Dr. Mitchell's old research files." The name sent a ripple of tension through the defenders, because Webb's work had been classified at levels that suggested involvement in the very research that might have created their nightmare. Elena emerged from the basement with the children clustered behind her like frightened ducklings, their wide eyes reflecting the adults' uncertainty about whether these newcomers represented salvation or a new form of damnation. Dr. Mitchell's hands shook as he recognized Webb through the reinforced glass, memories of academic conferences and research collaborations flooding back from the world before the dead began to walk. "Jackson was part of the military's bioweapons program," he whispered to Marcus, his voice barely audible above the distant sounds of combat. "If anyone knows how this virus was created and why it's evolving, it would be him." The weight of that knowledge hung heavy in the air as Hayes made the command decision that would either save them all or seal their doom, slowly unbarring the door while his team maintained firing positions that could eliminate the newcomers in seconds if they proved to be a threat. The cold night air rushed in as the survivors stumbled through the entrance, bringing with them the acrid smell of smoke and death that had become the perfume of their dying world. Jackson Webb's first words confirmed their worst fears and offered their only hope in the same breath. "The virus was never supposed to evolve like this," he said, his voice carrying the weight of scientific responsibility and personal guilt. "We designed it to create compliant subjects for military applications, but something went wrong during the initial outbreak. The pathogen is adapting faster than our models predicted, incorporating genetic material from its hosts to enhance its survival capabilities." Amanda immediately began examining the newcomers for bite marks and signs of infection, her medical training demanding caution even as her human compassion recognized their desperate need for help. Among Webb's group were two children, siblings named Danny and Lisa Chin, whose presence added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation as Elena struggled to integrate traumatized young minds into their fragile community structure. Rebecca's radio equipment picked up fragmented transmissions that painted a grim picture of the regional situation, with settlement after settlement falling silent as the coordinated Alpha attacks proved devastatingly effective against traditional defensive strategies. "We intercepted communications from the Aurora group before we fled," reported Sarah Martinez, one of Webb's survivors and a former telecommunications specialist. "The Alphas were using captured radio equipment to coordinate their attacks and share tactical information between different hordes. They're not just individually intelligent, they're building a collective consciousness." Tyler worked alongside Robert to redistribute their dwindling supplies among the expanded group, calculating ratios and consumption rates that made clear their resources would last days rather than weeks with additional mouths to feed and bodies to protect. The integration of Webb's group created immediate tensions as established hierarchies and relationships faced the strain of accommodating desperate strangers who brought valuable knowledge but also represented additional vulnerabilities in their increasingly precarious situation. Hayes found himself balancing the tactical advantages of additional fighters against the psychological pressure of protecting more lives, while Webb's scientific expertise offered potential solutions that came with the terrible cost of confronting the origins of humanity's downfall. As dawn approached and the Alpha assault continued with relentless intelligence, the survivors realized that their unlikely alliance might represent their last chance to understand and defeat an enemy that grew stronger and smarter with each passing hour, learning from every mistake they made and every strategy they employed in their desperate fight for survival. The decision to venture into Denver's abandoned subway system came at dawn on the third day of siege, when their ammunition reserves had dwindled to less than 50 rounds per defender and the Alpha zombies had begun systematically dismantling their barricades with an engineering precision that defied every assumption about undead intelligence. Elena Rodriguez volunteered to lead the underground expedition despite Hayes' protests, her determination fueled by maternal desperation as she watched the children's faces grow gaunt with hunger and hollow with the particular terror that comes from understanding that the adults meant to protect them were running out of options. The subway entrance 3 blocks east of the theater had been sealed since the early days of the outbreak, but Jackson Webb's military clearance codes and knowledge of government contingency plans suggested that beneath the rubble and makeshift barriers lay access to a classified bunker system that might contain weapons, supplies, or even research data that could turn the tide of their impossible war. Marcus assembled a team of 6 volunteers for the subterranean mission, each member chosen for skills that might prove crucial in the lightless depths where the virus had been evolving in isolation for 3 years. Tyler Brooks brought his mechanical expertise and an improvised cutting torch fabricated from theater equipment, while Maria Santos carried her sniper rifle despite the close quarters limitations. Her keen eyes adapted to spotting threats in minimal visibility. Dr. Mitchell insisted on joining the expedition despite his age, arguing that any scientific equipment or research materials they discovered would require his expertise to evaluate and utilize. Amanda Foster reluctantly remained behind to tend to the wounded, though her medical knowledge would have been invaluable in assessing any biological hazards they might encounter in the underground ecosystem that had developed beyond human observation. The descent into the subway tunnels revealed a world transformed by 3 years of viral evolution and environmental isolation, where bioluminescent fungi created an eerie blue-green glow that painted the abandoned platforms an otherworldly light. Elena's flashlight beam cut through the perpetual twilight, revealing walls covered in what appeared to be organic growth patterns that pulsed with a rhythm disturbingly similar to a heartbeat. The air carried a thick, sweet smell that made their respirators feel inadequate, and the sound of their footsteps echoed with strange harmonics that suggested the tunnel acoustics had been altered by the biological modifications growing throughout the underground system. Tyler's engineering background helped him identify that the fungal networks had somehow integrated with the electrical systems, creating a living infrastructure that responded to their presence with subtle changes in luminosity and temperature. The first encounter with the subterranean zombies came without warning as Elena's team navigated through what had once been the Union Station platform, now transformed into a nightmarish cavern where the infected had adapted to their lightless environment in ways that challenged every assumption about viral mutation. These creatures moved with a fluid grace that belied their decomposing appearance, their eyes reflecting the fungal glow with an intelligence that seemed even more focused and predatory than the alphas attacking the theater above. Dr. Mitchell documented their observations with trembling hands, noting that these underground variants appeared to have developed enhanced hearing and tactile sensitivity to compensate for the perpetual darkness, making them nearly impossible to approach undetected. Maria's military training proved invaluable as she guided the team through what had become a three-dimensional maze where threats could emerge from maintenance shafts, ventilation ducts, and service tunnels that the adapted zombies navigated with the confidence of creatures that had claimed this territory as their evolutionary laboratory. The government bunker, when they finally located it behind a wall of reinforced concrete that had been partially dissolved by some form of biological acid, contained equipment and supplies that represented both salvation and a horrifying revelation about the true scope of the military's pre-outbreak research. Jackson Webb's access codes worked on systems that had been running on backup power for 3 years, revealing classified files that documented not just the virus's creation, but detailed projections of its evolutionary potential that proved the current crisis had been anticipated and planned for by researchers who had apparently underestimated the speed and scope of the pathogen's adaptation. Elena discovered weapons caches that included experimental biological countermeasures, but the technical manuals required to deploy them safely were written in scientific terminology that would require Dr. Mitchell's interpretation and Jackson Webb's insider knowledge to implement without causing additional catastrophic mutations. The return journey through the tunnel system became a desperate race against time as the underground zombies, apparently alerted to their presence by some form of chemical communication system integrated with the fungal networks, began converging on their position from throughout the subterranean complex. Elena's team fought their way back to the surface with valuable intelligence and supplies, but also with the terrifying knowledge that the virus had been conducting evolutionary experiments in isolation beneath their feet, creating variants that might prove even more dangerous than the alphas currently besieging their sanctuary above ground, and that the government bunker's research suggested the outbreak had been far more deliberate and far-reaching than any of them had imagined possible. The revelation came in the form of a fever that Jackson Webb could no longer hide, his face flushed with the telltale signs of viral infection as he worked frantically in the theater's basement laboratory alongside Dr. Mitchell to decode the government research they had retrieved from the underground bunker. Webb's hands trembled not from exhaustion but from the early stages of cellular transformation as he explained the horrifying truth that had been classified at the highest levels of military command. "The virus wasn't an accident," he whispered, his voice already carrying the subtle changes that preceded full zombification. "It was designed to create a controllable population of enhanced soldiers, but the researchers underestimated the pathogen's ability to evolve beyond their programming parameters." His confession hung in the air like a death sentence as Marcus realized that their only hope for understanding the enemy's intelligence might be dying before their eyes, taking with him the scientific knowledge that could save what remained of humanity. Amanda Foster's medical examination confirmed what they all feared but none wanted to acknowledge. Webb had been bitten during the underground expedition, probably by one of the subterranean variants whose adaptations made their attacks nearly undetectable until the infection had already taken hold. The bite mark on his shoulder, hidden beneath layers of clothing and tactical gear, showed signs of an accelerated infection process that suggested these underground zombies carried a more virulent strain of the virus. Elena watched from the laboratory doorway as Webb struggled to maintain his humanity long enough to complete the weapon synthesis that might turn the alpha zombies against each other, his scientific mind racing against the biological clock that would soon transform him into the very enemy he was trying to defeat. The ethical implications of allowing an infected person to remain among them created a moral crisis that divided the survivors into factions, with some demanding immediate quarantine and others arguing that Webb's knowledge was too valuable to lose. Rebecca's monitoring of regional communications revealed a pattern of betrayal spreading across the remaining survivor settlements, as the psychological pressure of the coordinated alpha attacks began breaking down the social bonds that had held communities together through 3 years of apocalyptic survival. Reports filtered in of settlements turning against each other, accusations of collaboration with the intelligent zombies, and desperate groups making deals with alpha leaders in exchange for temporary protection from the larger hordes. It's exactly what the virus was designed to do, Webb explained through gritted teeth as the infection spread through his nervous system. Create division and mistrust among the target population while building a hierarchy of controlled subjects who retain enough intelligence to manage the others. His words carried the weight of scientific certainty and personal guilt as he described how the military had planned to use the virus to create puppet governments in occupied territories. Robert Kim's careful inventory management revealed a devastating truth that Hayes had been trying to hide from the group. Their supplies would last less than 48 hours even with strict rationing, and the weapons retrieved from the government bunker required technical expertise that only Webb possessed to operate safely. The former grocery store manager who had kept them fed through countless shortages now faced the impossible task of calculating survival probabilities that grew smaller with each passing hour. Tyler worked desperately to modify the experimental biological weapons using Webb's increasingly incoherent instructions, racing against time as their creators succumbed to the very virus he had helped design. Maria maintained her sniper position despite exhaustion and dwindling ammunition, watching the alpha zombies below demonstrate new tactical innovations that suggested they were learning from the underground variants through some form of viral information sharing. The moment of ultimate sacrifice came when Webb, recognizing that his transformation was accelerating beyond his ability to control, made the decision that would define the final phase of their battle for survival. With Dr. Mitchell's help, he configured the biological weapon to target the specific genetic markers that distinguished alpha zombies from their mindless counterparts, but the activation process required living tissue from an infected subject to calibrate the targeting parameters. "I won't become one of them," Webb declared with the last remnants of his scientific objectivity, handing Elena the activation device as his eyes began to cloud with viral transformation. "But my sacrifice can give you the weapon you need to turn their own intelligence against them." Amanda tried desperately to slow the infection with the medical supplies they had remaining, but Webb's knowledge of the virus's design allowed him to predict exactly how much time they had before he would lose the capacity for rational thought and voluntary action. As Webb's humanity slipped away in the theater's basement laboratory, surrounded by the research equipment and classified documents that represented both humanity's greatest scientific achievement and its most catastrophic failure, the survivors realized that victory against the alpha zombies would require them to become as ruthless and calculating as their evolved enemies, using the sacrifice of their own people as weapons in a war that had already claimed most of the human race and would demand even more before the final battle could be won. The biological weapon that Jackson Webb had died to create pulsed with an eerie bioluminescent glow in Dr. Mitchell's trembling hands, its organic components writhing within the containment cylinder like a living thing that hungered for release into the world above. Marcus stared at the device that represented their final hope, knowing that its deployment would require them to capture a living alpha zombie for the targeting system to lock onto the specific genetic markers that distinguished the intelligent variants from their mindless siblings. The irony wasn't lost on any of them that their salvation depended on getting close enough to their most dangerous enemies to essentially invite death into their sanctuary, but with less than 24 hours of supplies remaining and the theater's defenses crumbling under the relentless assault of creatures that learned from every failed attack, desperation had become their only tactical advisor. Hayes assembled his remaining fighters in the orchestra pit one final time, looking into faces that had aged years in the span of days, each bearing the hollow-eyed expression of people who had watched their world die and knew they were about to join it. Tyler Brooks and Maria Santos volunteered for what everyone understood would be a suicide mission. Their partnership forged through countless dangerous reconnaissance operations, now facing its ultimate test against enemies that could anticipate human tactics and adapt their strategies in real time. Tyler's mechanical genius had produced a capture device built from theater rigging equipment and electrical components salvaged from the government bunker, designed to immobilize an alpha zombie long enough for the biological weapon to complete its genetic scan without alerting the larger horde to their desperate gambit. Maria's sniper training would be crucial for identifying and isolating a target from the coordinated pack hunters that had turned the streets around the theater into a tactical nightmare where every shadow could conceal an intelligent predator. Elena insisted on joining the mission despite having children depending on her leadership, arguing that her experience in the underground tunnels had taught her to recognize the subtle behavioral differences between alpha variants that might prove crucial for selecting the right specimen. Dr. Mitchell worked frantically to calibrate the weapon's targeting system using tissue samples from Webb's transformed remains, his scientific training warring with his revulsion at what their survival had reduced them to doing. The device required precise biological input to distinguish between the enhanced cognitive functions of alpha zombies and the baseline viral infection that drove the mindless hordes, but the margin for error was so small that a single miscalculation could result in a weapon that would target all infected tissue, including any survivors who might be carrying dormant viral loads. Amanda Foster prepared what few medical supplies remained for treating the inevitable casualties of their desperate plan, knowing that even success would likely cost them most of their remaining fighters and leave the children and elderly survivors defenseless against any alphas that might survive the biological attack. Rebecca coordinated their communications equipment to broadcast the mission's progress to any surviving settlements within radio range, hoping that other groups might learn from their sacrifice even if they didn't live to see the results. The capture operation began at dawn on the fourth day of siege, when alpha fatigue patterns suggested a brief window of reduced alertness that might allow Tyler and Maria to isolate a target from the main horde. Hayes created a diversion at the theater's main entrance, using precious ammunition and explosive charges to draw the majority of alpha attention away from the side alley where the capture team would make their attempt. The plan required split-second timing and flawless execution, with Marcus coordinating the various elements from his command post on the theater's roof while Elena guided Tyler and Maria through the urban maze that the alphas had transformed into their hunting ground. The selected target was a former military officer whose alpha transformation had retained enough tactical knowledge to make him a leader among the intelligent zombies, but whose isolated position during a patrol rotation made him vulnerable to their desperate gambit. The capture succeeded at a cost that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, as Tyler's restraint device functioned perfectly but required him to sacrifice himself to maintain the electrical current that kept their alpha prisoner subdued long enough for the biological weapon to complete its genetic scan. Maria's covering fire eliminated 3 other alphas that attempted to rescue their captured leader, but her position became untenable as the main horde responded to the disturbance with a coordinated assault that forced Hayes to abandon the theater's lower levels. The weapon's activation sent waves of biological energy through the surrounding area, targeting the specific genetic markers that Webb had identified as unique to alpha intelligence, and the survivors watched from their remaining stronghold as the creatures that had brought humanity to the brink of extinction began turning on each other with the same ruthless efficiency they had previously directed against human settlements, their enhanced intelligence becoming the very weakness that would destroy them. The silence that settled over Denver in the hours following the biological weapons deployment was more profound than any quiet the survivors had experienced since the outbreak began, broken only by the distant sounds of alpha zombies tearing each other apart as their enhanced intelligence turned into a self-destructive obsession that spread through their ranks like wildfire. Marcus stood on the theater's damaged roof, watching through his binoculars as the creatures that had brought humanity to the brink of extinction engaged in savage combat against their own kind, their tactical coordination fragmenting into chaotic violence as the weapon's genetic targeting corrupted the very cognitive enhancements that had made them so dangerous. The streets below, which had been filled with organized predators just hours before, now resembled a battlefield where decomposing soldiers fought wars against phantoms created by their own deteriorating minds, leaving piles of truly dead bodies that would never rise again to threaten the living. Dr. Mitchell emerged from his basement laboratory with trembling hands and tears streaming down his weathered face, carrying radio equipment that had been broadcasting automated distress signals for 3 days without response until this morning, when voices began filtering through the static from survivor settlements across Colorado and beyond. "Marcus, you need to hear this," he called out, his voice cracking with exhaustion and something that might have been hope. The radio chatter revealed that similar biological weapons had been deployed simultaneously across the country, apparently triggered by the same genetic markers that Webb had identified, suggesting that other government bunkers had contained identical research and that surviving scientists in multiple locations had reached the same desperate conclusion about how to turn the virus against itself. Rebecca's communication station became a hub of activity as reports flooded in from settlements in Wyoming, Utah, and even distant locations like Phoenix and Seattle, all confirming that the alpha zombie populations were experiencing the same self-destructive breakdown that had saved Denver. Elena Rodriguez gathered the settlement's surviving children in the theater's main auditorium, where morning sunlight streamed through windows that were no longer barricaded, illuminating young faces that had forgotten what safety felt like. Timothy Walsh, the 8-year-old who had asked if the monsters were getting smarter, now wanted to know if the quiet meant they could go outside and play in the sunshine, his innocent question highlighting the psychological challenges that would face an entire generation of survivors who had grown up knowing only fear and confinement. Amanda Foster worked tirelessly to treat the wounded survivors, her medical supplies stretched beyond their limits but her spirits lifted by the knowledge that she was healing people who might actually live to see old age in a world where the undead were no longer an existential threat to human civilization. The theater that had served as humanity's last stand in Colorado was slowly transforming back into a place where culture and community could flourish, though the memories of what they had endured would forever change how they understood the fragility of human society. Maria Santos led the first reconnaissance mission beyond the theater's perimeter in 4 days, moving cautiously through streets littered with the remains of alpha zombies that had destroyed each other in their final, frenzied battles. Her sniper training proved invaluable for identifying which bodies were truly dead versus those that might still pose a threat, but the overwhelming evidence suggested that the biological weapon had been devastatingly effective in eliminating the intelligent variants that had made traditional zombie combat tactics obsolete. Hayes coordinated the establishment of contact protocols with other survivor groups, his military experience crucial for organizing the logistics of reconnecting scattered communities and beginning the massive task of reclaiming territory that had been lost to the undead. Robert Kim's organizational skills shifted from rationing survival supplies to planning the distribution of resources needed for reconstruction, calculating how 47 survivors could expand their operations to support the refugees who would inevitably seek shelter as word spread that Denver was secure. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of survivors from across the region, drawn by radio broadcasts that promised safety and the hope of rebuilding civilization from the ashes of the old world. Marcus found himself thrust into a leadership role he had never wanted, making decisions about resource allocation, security protocols, and community governance that would determine whether their hard-won victory would lead to sustainable recovery or collapse under the weight of too much hope and too few resources. As autumn arrived and the first snow began to fall on Denver's recovering streets, the survivors realized that defeating the alpha zombies had been only the beginning of their challenge. The real work of rebuilding humanity, creating new social structures, preserving knowledge and culture, and healing the psychological wounds inflicted by 3 years of apocalyptic survival, would take generations to complete. Yet for the first time since the outbreak began, children played in the streets without fear, and adults could imagine a future where their species might not only survive but thrive in a world that had tested every limit of human endurance and emerged with a deeper understanding of both their capacity for destruction and their potential for redemption.